We are going to be finishing up the syntax of PHP and then getting into forms today, how you do forms in HTML, which is necessary in order for you both to know how to do web scripting and also necessary so that you know how to do the back end in PHP. So in fact, today we're focusing more, after we get through the PHP syntax, we're actually moving over to the client side for today before moving back to the server side on Tuesday. So there's three things we need to finish up with PHP syntax, which are arrays, loops, and regular expressions. So we'll start with arrays, which are somewhat similar to Perl in that there's two types, numeric and associative hash tables. But in fact, PHP has a unified model for arrays. All arrays are actually associative arrays, and numeric arrays, i.e. ones that are indexed starting at 0, are actually just associative arrays where the 0, 1, 2, 3 are keys. And one way you can observe that is in Perl, if you create a list of numbers that say 0, 1, 2, and 3, and then you say $nums 100 equals 100, you'll find that Perl has actually created a list with 101 items and has filled in indices 4 to 99 with the value 0. So after you do this assignment statement, you actually have a list that looks like 0, 1, 2, 3, 0, 0, 0, 100. Okay? If you do the same thing in PHP, you don't have that list. You have a list which is actually, in effect, you have 0 mapping to 0, 1 maps to 1, 2 maps to 2, 3 maps to 3, and 100 maps to 100. You'll have an array that consists of 5 elements. So PHP is different than Perl in that it has this one unified mechanism for arrays, and all arrays are actually associative arrays, but you can treat them as being indexed from 0 if you wish. So you can also, there are multiple ways to introduce arrays in PHP. One is with the array keyword and then a list, comma separated list. Another way is to simply, because of dynamic typing, you can simply assign a string to an array as though it were an indexed array, and if it were not previously an array object, PHP will create an array object for you, and it would set, in this case, the key 0 to Peter and the key 1 to Quagmire. And then this form, the third form, does appending. And if you do not already have an array, it will start the array at 0. But if you already have one, like here, this would add Quagmire as entry 1 at index 1. So in general, just saying array without a key value will do an appending of the value to the array. Now, for this to really make sense, it should be one that you've been indexing. I haven't even bothered to figure out what happens if you're mixing integer indices with keys. Some things you just shouldn't do, and you should expect garbage behavior if you do it. Okay? So only try this form of appending if you're using indexed arrays. With associative arrays, they have a syntax similar to Perl, where you can use that equal greater than sign to separate key value pairs and make it clear that that's the type of array you want. Or you can simply assign keys and values by putting the key in square brackets. How does that differ from hash table in Perl. It helps to review this because it sets it in your mind. What would be the similar syntax in Perl? There's a slight difference. Using square brackets here. Curly braces is what you use in Perl. Okay? Not square brackets for associative arrays. So that's the difference. And then if you want to create multi-dimensional arrays, you can do that by simply embedding arrays in a list. So here we have an outer array, and then we have a list of 3 key value pairs. Each key is a string, and each value is an array. So this was meant to actually show families and maybe the head of household plus perhaps the people in the families. And then you could access it just like you would expect. So the first key being the name of the family member heading the family, and the second being an index into that person's families. Okay, some useful functions. I'm not going to go through all of them, but print R array is very helpful for dumping the contents of an array in formatted form for debugging. Don't use it for outputting information to the browser because the formatting will get lost. It's simply outputting it in a nice ASCII format using \ns. It's not using HTML formatting. So print R will look horrible if you actually dump it to a web page. It'll just run together. But it looks nice if you're debugging at the command line. So use that if you need to dump the contents of an array. You don't have to iterate through a loop if you do that. You can see what it looks like. I don't have an example off the top of my head. And then count returns the number of items in an array. So that's very helpful. Now, question. In Perl, this is very handy. What does this do in Perl? It indexes from the back. What do you suppose it does in PHP? It's a hash table. So if it's a hash table, what does it actually do? It creates a key with -1 and assigns the value 10 to it. So you have to be careful. Unfortunately, that's the Faustian bargain PHP got when it combined its associative and numeric arrays, is you can't use -1 to index from the back of an array like you did in Perl. -1 will be treated as a key here. So don't try that little trick. It will have bad results. Yes?
Like with the other array, you put 100 in the field of the values in between the 0. If you were to put something like -6, would it fill in?
Yes. So if you then in Perl, if you said in Perl now after this statement, it would put something into location 94, I believe.
No, I'm saying PHP, that's the one that fills in zeros, right?
No, that's Perl. Perl does the fill-in. PHP does not. This is PHP. PHP is creating an associative table actually for its indexed arrays, and therefore there is no filling in of zeros. Okay? Actually, I'm not so sure if you had just this and you said ace of -6. I'm not sure if it would actually create, I don't think so because Perl's starts at index 0. So I'm not actually sure what happens if you try to index past the beginning of an array in Perl. But you can always try it.
You can make it undef.
Undef would be probably a legitimate thing. Nicer would be error, subscript out of range, but okay. The other, just take a look. You have the normal array pushes, pop, shift, unshift, behave the way you expect. Actually, here's an example of print R dumping an array nicely for you to see its contents. Then you have two types of sorts in PHP. You have a sort, which is associative array sort, sorts the values of an array. Typically, you would use this. A sort you would tend to use with what you would consider to be an index array. And K sort stands for key sort. You would tend to do that with an associative hash table. And you can actually give a sort type, which can either be the constant sort numeric or sort string. So that way you can control whether it's numeric or alphanumeric sorting. And there's also a reverse sort available in case you want to sort in reverse order. And there's also a sort method that allows you to provide a function for doing comparisons, but unfortunately it's not in my notes, and off the top of my head I do not remember what the name of that function is. The sorting is done in place. So it destroys the previous order, or destroys, in some sense, the previous array and replaces it with a sorted array. And if you do an A sort on a true associative array that has keys and values, it literally sorts it into order based on the values, and it really doesn't have much meaning. So, but it does work. Okay, loops, just like in C, there's no until anymore. And the for each is different than in Perl. So in PHP, the entire clause is within the parentheses. The first argument is the list you're iterating through. The second one is the loop variable. If you remember, in Perl, it was for each, then it was the loop variable, and then it was the list in parentheses. That was Perl. So PHP has slightly different syntax. And then you can also iterate through the keys, value pairs of an associative array using that syntax. The keys will come back in arbitrary order, probably the order in which they hash to the hash table, meaning if key 73 hashes to 0 and key 55 hashes to 5, then it's probably going to come back with 73 first because that's at location 0, and 55 is going to come back second because it hashes to location 5. So the keys are going to be out of order. If you want to iterate through the keys in sorted order, what would you do first? Call ksort. Okay, so just, you're going to get these syntactic things wrong. Believe me, when you're going back and forth all the time between these languages, it's so annoying because it's just subtle variations. Another just super subtle variation is, remember in Perl it was else if. In PHP it is else if with no space. Although it also works if there is a space. Okay? And in Python, so this is Perl, this is PHP, and Python is what? ELIF. It's like they're trying to avoid copyright infringement. So, pardon? Okay, at any rate. So in PHP it's else if, but I just generally put a space between it. Okay, and then regular expressions are modeled after Perl regular expressions. I believe that, well, no, I don't remember if there's also Emacs style regular expressions in PHP or not. But if you want Perl regular expressions, there's a Perl regular expression match The first argument is a string with the Perl pattern inside of it. And just as in Perl, you have to put the slanted lines and the string that you're matching against. And then the array will contain the capture groups. So in Perl, how are the capture groups handled? $1, $2, $3. In PHP, they come back in an array. Entry 0 is a match for the entire substring. So for example, if I have preg match, and this is my pattern, so it's matching a date, and this is my string, then the array comes back. The entire match for that pattern is 2, 3, 64. The first capture pattern is the month, that's 2. The second capture pattern over here is the year, 1964. Okay, so it comes back as an array. And you'll also remember that in Perl, if you wanted to get successive matches, how did you do that? Let's say you want to get all of the matches in a string for time, like homework for prom 4 or 5. How did you do that? Dash or /G. And you put that in a while loop. But in Perl, you can simply give it preg match all, and now it will find all matches and put them into this array. This array, each entry is now a list with all of the captures for that particular group. So now, if my list is these 3 dates, and I do preg matches all, then my matches comes back with these 4, because there were 4 dates matching everything. The first group matches the months, so 1, 2, 9, and 10, hence down here 1, 2, 9, and 10. And the second group matched on the years 64, 64, 65, and 30. Okay, so that's handy because that was an improvement on Perl. That G option gets a lot of you, and you get it with experience, but it's kind of nice that it returns it all at once. And the disadvantage, obviously, is if you have a big string, it could consume a lot of memory. But you're not typically running your scripts over an enormous file, so it's really not supposed to be a huge issue doing it this way. And remember, this is usually running some back end from the client, so you're not typically getting a huge amount of data off of this. Okay, you can do replacement. In Perl, it was called substitution. They call it the replace command in PHP. You give it a pattern, the replacement pattern, the string, and an optional argument is the limit. So you can limit the number of substitutions that occur. And they used a funky syntax. I don't know why, but the pattern is supposed to be exactly like Perl syntax with the forward slashes, but the replacement pattern isn't. So you don't put slashes in the replacement pattern, but you do for the regular matching pattern. So that's just a gotcha. If you don't do that and you put slashes in the replace pattern, you'll get slashes in your output. Kind of annoying. And the $1, $2, $3, what do they refer to? Your capture group 1, 2, and 3. So in this case, they behave just like the numeric variables in Perl. Yes?
That's the same thing as \1.
Yes, that's the same thing as \1, \2 in Perl. Okay. And that takes care of all the things I wanted to say about PHP syntax for the time being. This remaining stuff we'll get to when we get to the server stuff. So questions about anything with PHP's basic syntax? Okay, and we're not covering its object model. It does have objects, but we're not covering them. Okay, so moving on to forms. So you use forms all the time. We go to Expedia. We'll see an example of, here's a fancy form for Expedia. So a form is a way of collecting information. And a form has three primary elements, only two of which you can see here. So in some sense, the third element is the entire form. So think of it as the background. So there's the form markup element, which I'll get to in a moment, which indicates you have a form. Then all of these, what we call widgets, which are used to collect information to be sent to the server. And then one or more submit buttons, in this case the search button, that submits the form data to the server. So in this case, this is the submit form button. Okay, so three elements. One, some element that introduces the form. Two, the widgets that collect information. And then three, the submit form button to submit that information to the server. The way that forms are handled in browsers, and in fact the way information is displayed, is via a markup language called HTML. And this course is not about HTML. Occasionally we will say certain things about it, but HTML, hypertext markup language, and it uses what are called markup tags to mark up text. So the markup tags just introduce structural elements like paragraphs. So P stands for a paragraph, or you can introduce a table with a table markup. And then TR is a row within a table. TD is a table column. And you terminate each element with a backslash. So there is an extended form of HTML called XHTML that imposes certain restrictions. One of them being that all markup elements are terminated by a slash. The second one, they're all properly nested. So for example, you would not have the backslash P before the backslash table. So you have appropriate nesting of your elements. So the markup, and then you have content between some of your markup tags. And these elements allow a browser to lay out your document. Now there's a second thing called cascading style sheets, which again we won't talk about in this course. But style sheets allow you to specify formatting for each of these document structures. So you can indicate, for example, that perhaps the paragraph body should be in 10-point Times New Roman with, say, 0.1 inch between each lines and the first line indented 1/4 of an inch. Or with a table, you might say that you want the table entries to be separated with a border 2 pixels thick that's black, and you may want padding in each cell, table cell, perhaps 5 pixels on each side. That can all be specified via cascading style sheets. So they give you a way to, let's actually just show you a quick example of the cascading style sheet. Whoops, don't want to capture it. Okay, so this was actually the formatting I used for your exam. Oh, come on. Is that not working? There we go. What? Something's haywire. Really haywire. What the heck is going on here? Emacs is behaving funny. Okay, let's just try it this way. Okay, so you can see that for a table, or actually I had this thing page break, and I had page break before always. So if this is something where I could specify as part of a paragraph, I could say that its formatting in part is controlled using this page break thing. And it said page break before always, meaning it always created a page break. Here it said that if an ordered list was embedded within an order list, that the bullet type should be lower alphanumeric, so A, B, C, D, E, rather than 1, 2, 3. So if I had OL and then within it an embedded OL, it would show up as say 1A, B, C like that. So you can see that the cascading style sheet is a set of basically key value pairs, and the keys are things that are recognized by a browser for formatting. Okay, now normally you don't have to mess with these because you'll use some kind of editor, and the editor will automatically create the style sheets for you. But it's helpful to know what's going on. So to create a form, you have a form element. Let's see if I believe I have an example I can show you quickly. There we go, form.html. Okay, so you can see that you introduce a form with the markup element form. Then the general thing is it has two attributes that we'll get to in a moment, but we'll skip that for a moment. Then you can see we have some widgets, and at the end we have a submit button and a reset button. So if I display this, that's what it looks like. Okay, and we'll be going through this kind of line by line to help you see what's going on. And this is an HTML document, so this is appearing on the client side. Okay, so we start out, and again we introduce form elements with this keyword form, and there's two attributes, method and action. Okay, action is easier to describe. It is the name of a script that should be executed on the server side when the submit button is pushed. So a script that is executed on the server side when the submit button is pressed. And in this case, it's saying that the script is in the same directory as the .html page. You could use an URL here instead of a relative addressing, and then it would go to that URL. Or you could, if the scripts were put in a subdirectory, then you would have your subdirectory here followed by a slash. The method indicates how the data is transmitted, how the form data gets transmitted. And there's two methods. One is get and one is post. And the essential difference is get, in effect, posts the data in the clear, and post protects it. So with get, you can actually, let's go to the notes for a moment. It doesn't show it, shoot. Okay, well, when you submit a form, you'll sometimes see a question mark, and then you will see some information like foo, and I always get it wrong exactly, but forget what the separator is. Ampersand, thank you. Probably can't see that very well either. So what I'm doing is sometimes when you submit you can execute a script directly from the browser window, and you put a question mark, and then what occurs afterwards are name value pairs, which is the form data that is getting submitted to the back end. And when you do it this way, you're using the get submission method because you can see what the data is. A script that allows data to be submitted using get can be invoked essentially from the browser window, which is dangerous, obviously, because it allows you to bypass the form. And the form is doing, the form is doing various types of type checking, presumably, on your data, plus guaranteeing that certain data is present. But it has an advantage as well, which is if your site is just meant for querying, not for changing things, but for being queried, then a web crawler or a robot can automatically query your site by submitting the appropriate script name along with this information. So I believe that's how Kayak ends up querying Priceline and Expedia and the other sites, is by doing it. I'm not positive, but it's certainly one conceivable way. So get allows you to invoke a script from this browser line. Post is intended to prevent that. Post hides this form data and sends it so that you can't see it as a user, which means that you can't invoke a script, supposedly, using post from a browser window because the form data is not sent as part of that string. So post is considered more secure and is typically used when you are going to be sending information to the server that might modify the server. So basically, you use get. Okay, so use get when your browser, when your site is for querying. Okay, and then use post when your site can be modified. That's the general rule of thumb. So each has their advantage and disadvantage. Gets, in some sense, less secure, but if you're not allowing, if your site is really just meant to allow someone to query a database, it's a fine way of making your site available to robots.
Well, there are other differences between get and post requests, like how the responses are going to be, right?
Yes, but I'm talking about this at a high level. Okay. Also post, there's some other reasons, which is long strings must be submitted using post. So most browsers have a limit on the length of the string that can be submitted via post. And that can vary. Pardon? Oh, sorry. Yeah, long strings must be submitted via post because there is a restriction on the length of a string that can be submitted via get. And that varies from site to site. Okay, Demi.
Okay. Even when you're using a post, you still need to do all necessary validation server side because it's possible, because it's very easy for, say, a hacker to bypass your validation by submitting the post request directly.
Correct. So what Demi is saying is you can't assume that just because you're using post that the user hasn't found a way to sidestep your form validation. It could have found a way to sidestep your form validation. So you always have to treat the form data you receive on the server side as suspect. But get, as I said, makes it easy to query your site from a robot. Post makes it harder. Okay, so these are keywords. And in this case, you can see I'm using the keyword get. Okay, so those are generally the two attributes. So these things are called attribute value pairs. And the attributes in XHTML are supposed to be, the value should be in quotes. Next, you can put comments. This is an HTML comment. This is just a normal markup that is being put into the form. Here are some here are some actual widgets, what we call widgets, or things that are inputting values. So in this, there's basically I would say 2 to 3 major types of widgets. So types of widgets. Okay, broadly speaking, they can be either selection widgets or text widgets. So selection, allowing you to select from a group of items. And text, allowing you free-form entry. So with select, there are things like radio buttons, checkboxes, buttons, sliders, and in HTML5, a whole bevy of other input like dates, times, date time, color, most of which are not yet implemented by browsers. And then text typically is either one line or multiple line. In general, we try to use selection widgets if possible because they limit the possibility of user error. So an overriding precept or principle of form design is to prevent the user from making an error and entering invalid data. Text objects are ripe for entering invalid data. For example, if I say enter a quantity in a text window, then someone might enter a string, or they might enter an invalid number such as a negative quantity. Whereas a selection gadget allows you to restrict the set of items from which a user can make a choice, and also it shows the user the valid set of choices. So when possible, we try to use selection gadgets. Okay, I also forgot menus as an important item. Okay, so radio buttons and checkboxes are the best in some sense at displaying choices because they display all choices simultaneously. Which is nice. Okay, but their drawback is they hog real estate. So there's a trade-off in using them because they take up space. Okay, down here, even though it may not look like it, in effect these colors are radio buttons. I can select one of them at a time. Basically, these things are all radio buttons down here, all of these tools. So radio buttons give you an exclusive choice. Checkboxes allow you to select multiple items. So going back to my form example, here, how would you rate your skill in programming? I'm giving you only one choice. And if I select Super Hacker, it deselects intermediate. So radio buttons give you an exclusive choice, whereas checkboxes, you can select multiple. So I agree to work for $1.50 a day, work 12-hour days, I won't show up late every day, and I will comment my code. Or I do like to show up late, and I don't like to work 12 hours a day. As you can see, they take up a fair amount of space on the screen. But, as I say, they display everything at one time. Okay. So, when should you use radio buttons? There's a general rule of thumb. And that rule is when you have less than or equal to 7 items. Why that number, 7? Anyone know? It is because adult working memory holds 7 plus or minus 2 items. So you can hold, on average, about 7 items in your short-term memory at one time, in effect in your RAM. So our RAM's pretty limited. Okay? Some can hold up to 9, some can hold only about 5. Okay? Blessed are those who have the ability to store 9. There's a strong correlation between working memory and intelligence, or IQ, I should say. Okay, just the ability to hold more items seems to be linked to better performance on IQ tests. But what this means also is that if you put 7 or fewer items on the screen, your brain can suck all 7 items at once. It can deal with all 7 items at once. More than that, and it reverts to sequential search because it can't hold that many items in memory. So more than 7, and your brain basically reverts to going through the list as though it's a linear search. But with 7, it's like an array. It's constant time access. So 7 items is the magic number. If you have more than 7 items, you typically use a menu. Not always. Sometimes it's important enough that you still use radio buttons or checkboxes. So this isn't a hard and fast rule. It's just a general. It's a general rule of thumb. It's not hard and fast. Of course, on a test, if I say something like this, I expect you to answer. If I say that you have 5 mutually exclusive choices, I expect you to say radio buttons. If I say 10, I expect you to say menu. Okay? There's another reason, which is more than 7 items, and you also start to use up a considerable chunk of the screen. By the way, down here you see that that rule is in some sense violated because there's 8 tools here and there's 8 tools here. So sometimes it's just better to present all tools and be able to see all of them without having to go through a menu. Okay, but you see in general they're keeping it small. 5 items, 4 items, I think 10 items here. This is more like 3, 8 items, 8 items. It's not like it's huge. Yes, Greg? That's true. That's a good point too. So Greg's point is on a form you tend to set each element once. Here you're moving back and forth, and so it's helpful to have the items always up where you can see what your current choices are.
Visible data attached to these elements.
Right. So, okay. So greater than 7 items, typically you use a menu. A menu only shows one element at a time. So up here is my menu, but when I select, you get many more choices. So a menu uses far less screen real estate, but it still allows you to show all choices. Okay? Normally when you pick from a state, you get a list of 50 choices. When you select a country, you get a list of however 100 items. But it's still restricting you in what you can choose. Also notice how the items have been grouped. See the subtle gray lines? So you can actually do that. Notice how these menus are actually more than 7 items, but they're using the gray lines to actually categorize the commands, and you'll notice that they're actually tend to be fewer than 7 items in each group. Okay? So while you may use linear search to find the right group, once you've found the right group, your brain reverts to sucking it all in. Does anyone know the other advantage here for an expert? Expert knows roughly where in the menu to look. So the menu expert's eye will be drawn, won't even use linear search. The expert will know roughly where in the menu to expect the command. Their eye, for example, will go perhaps straight into this group, and then their brain will suck in all 5 items and immediately know which to select. But even for a novice, this helps because it helps them to do their linear search sometimes more quickly. Okay, so menus when you need more than 7 items, and sliders when choosing a number. Although there's some restrictions, which is you have to have a bound on those numbers because there is a limit on the number of pixels on your screen. So if I asked you to write a slider for selecting zip codes, you would fail because there's roughly 100,000 zip codes and there's not 100,000 pixels on your screen. So the number of numbers has to be at least smaller than the number of pixels horizontally. You also need to have some margin of error. You can't expect someone to be able to stop on a single pixel. Our fine motor control isn't that good. Normally you have to allow a single number to have several pixels left and right. So the number that you can get with the slider varies, but probably it's on the order of low hundreds at most that you can get with a slider. And not all browsers do a good job of showing sliders. Here's Firefox. Notice you can't, that's just a normal slider. It's not showing me any labels, which is kind of annoying. So actually in Code Assessor, when I set up an exam, I have these nice looking sliders that I had to do myself. So this you can see is a basic Firefox slider, but I had to do the stuff that puts the 0 and the maximum on either side. And I also had to write code that indicated what the current value is, which is a huge pain in the neck. Yes, Demi?
Is Code Assessor something you wrote yourself?
Yes. Well, no. It was started by a senior design group, and then I did a lot of additional work. This particular form was written by me.
Have you thought of making it like publishing it either as open source or for profit?
So actually did give it to the UT Research Foundation, not UT Research, the thing that does publicize it, and there wasn't any interest in it. Because I'm one person, other people can put like 10, 15 people on it and get more sophistication.
Oh, are there
regrettably.
Are there other such tools out there?
There are similar tools done by other professors, so I actually haven't seen anything more sophisticated than Code Assessor.
Wait, that's...
We can discuss later. It doesn't seem to have much commercial potential, regrettably. But at any rate, the bottom line are things are pretty primitive in the browser. And then you also have newer input types like date, which are supposed to give you nice widgets, but let's go have a look at that. So, W3 schools. Here we go. Come on. Well, there's a time tag. Nope. Come on. Had it. There we go. So here's a date input type. So input type equals date. And it's supposed to give you a nice date pop-up. Nope. In Firefox, all I get is a text window. Okay, if I do it in Chrome, I get a little better, but it's still not a calendar. The whole idea that... oh, you're right. Thank you. That is new. Thanks, Greg. So you can drop down. So this is what it's supposed to look like. But you can see that support is vastly different by browser. So it's very dicey right now whether you use the new HTML5 widgets, because some browsers provide a lot of support for it and some provide crummy support for it. But all browsers provide good support for radial buttons, checkboxes, menus, and text. Not even sliders, as you saw. Okay. So, those are the basic rules, and then text you use for anything else when the set of choices is too large to represent any other way. So for example, zip code might be an example where you still have to use a text widget because there's too many of them. Although, if you first force the person to enter a city and a state, then you actually might be able to use a menu for the zip codes because typically there's a limited number of zip codes for a particular region. So sometimes you can use contextual information to narrow down the set of choices. Okay? But again, text is dangerous because it allows the user to enter invalid data. Now, it's not, when I say enter invalid data, you still have to check the data on the server side no matter what. But again, you try to prevent the user from inputting invalid data to begin with. Also, you can often check the data on the client side and save the server from having to take information and send it back and forth. So being able to do a certain amount of that checking to try to get the user to enter correct information helps if you can do it on the client side. And obviously regular expressions helps a lot in verifying data. Like when you enter a zip code, being able to specify a pattern of \D5, say dash \D4, whoops, question mark, well, the whole thing in question mark, can be a nice way of specifying the pattern for a zip code and automatically checking it. Okay, so questions about the general, when you use these things in general. Okay, then the way you introduce these things is with tags. So radio buttons and checkboxes are introduced with the input tag, and then they have a type attribute that specifies the type. So radio for radio buttons, checkbox for checkboxes. Then the name field is what will be, so when the form is submitted to the server, it goes in the form of name value pairs. So the form is submitted in the essentially as a list of name value pairs, and the name is whatever name you give the widget, and then the value is whatever value is associated with it. So in this case, I'm saying this radio button has a value of int, and its name is skill. As you can see, I have 3 inputs in this case with the same type. So having 3 radio buttons with the same, name indicates that they all belong to the same radio button group, and the browser will automatically make this a mutually exclusive set of buttons. So if you want items to belong to the same radio button group, you give them all the same name. Obviously, you should give them different values because that will be the value passed back to the form if that button is selected. These things, like intermediate, advanced, and super hacker, are outside of the input item. So they are actually not, in some sense, part of it. They're just giving information about that widget, but they're not part of it. Here, the first one, I actually embedded the input item inside of a label tag. The label tag makes it clear to the browser that this input type is associated with that label. That's useful for things, software like screen readers, for people who are visually challenged. Screen readers will read off information, and putting an input tag inside of a label tag makes it clear to a screen reader that that input widget is associated with that tag. Okay, whereas here, a screen reader would not know that intermediate is associated with this particular widget. Okay, and if you want one of the items to be checked, you can use the checked attribute to indicate that it should appear as checked when it comes up initially. And this will also mean that it is selected. Okay, checkbox is the same, except now the type is a checkbox. And again, if you put them, all checkboxes with the same name are considered to be part of the same group. Here, to make it easier for me to handle, I gave each of the checkboxes a different name. And you can see I made 3 of the 4 be checked when they came up. If you put checkboxes with the same name and multiple ones are selected, then it sends a list of the selected values with that name. So if I had named all 4 of these checkboxes work attribute and selected 3 of them, there would have been a work, say, attribute would have been the name, and it would have sent a list of, well, in this case, yes, 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 which obviously is pretty unuseful. So you would have had to make the values be something else, like, say, cheap labor and long days. So just out of curiosity, what do we think of this particular business? Sweatshop. Okay, but that, it would send it as a list to the browser. Not to the browser, to the server. Then for menus, a menu is introduced with a select tag and the menu items with options. So each menu item is an option tag embedded in a select statement, each of course with their own value. And now you do have a label for each of your options. So that was not true of radio buttons, but is true for your menu items. So you have a label embedded in the option. And then you obviously have some choices for the attributes for a menu. So the name is state. This little thing is telling the browser that if it is, I think, PHP, to send the items as a list. For some reason, and I think again it's PHP, if you don't use the array notation there, it won't send multiple items, it will only send one. Same with checkboxes. I think it's PHP that has that. Pardon? Okay, well, PHP will not get them all. PHP will only get the first one in the list. Whereas if you send it, if in the browser, if in the HTML document you use the array notation, then PHP on the back end gets all of the items. Okay, this says how many are visible at one time. So this says 5 menu items are visible at once. And this says multiple menu items can be selected. Okay, and as you can see, it's no longer checked. It's no longer the attribute. It is selected. This drives me crazy as a user interface person because they should have used consistent syntax and they didn't. There's no reason it should be checked for radio buttons and checkboxes and selected for a menu. But that was their choice, not mine. Okay, and if you want a drop-down menu, set the size to 1, and that will give you a browser should select a drop-down menu if you set the size to 1. Should. Doesn't guarantee it, but should give you a drop-down menu. Okay, so in my example, the size is 5. And as you can see, 5 items are showing up in my menu. Then for text, it's again input, just like for radio buttons and checkboxes, but now the type is text. Same thing, name and value. Now, if you provide a value, that is the text that will appear by default. If you provide an empty string or you omit the value, an empty string will appear in your text box. And there are additional attributes that you can provide. So find them. There we go. Size gives you the number of characters wide that your box should be, although this never seems to actually be true. You will find out that if you set the size to 10, you will probably be able to enter more. It will actually be more than wide to accommodate 10. So I tend to think of that as more saying that is the minimum number of characters that your box will accommodate. And max length is the maximum number of characters that the user can enter. So you may want to limit the size of an address, or it seems that a lot of browsers are keen on limiting my last name, which I don't know. I don't know how many of you with last names longer than 15 characters run into the same issue, but it seems like mine gets cut off sometime. Also, I've found that trying to enter electrical engineering and computer science as a department often lets me get cut off. So clearly they're putting a max length on the text box. Okay, so those are 2 additional attributes you can put on a text box. Then there are password boxes. The type is password rather than text with all the same attributes. And it will appear as a set of asterisks rather than as text. This is very important. There is no security here other than visual security. This does not transmit the text as an encrypted string. Only HTTPS will transmit it as an encrypted string. All that does is prevent someone like Greg, from looking over your shoulder and jotting down your password. Okay, that's all it does. So no security other than visual security. It still transmits the string in the clear if it's HTTP. And then we have text areas, which allow you to enter multiple lines of text. And you can specify the number of rows and the number of columns. The columns, again, being the minimum number of characters, rows being the number of lines. And you can put some default text. This time, instead of a value field, you put the default text as, in effect, a label embedded in the text area tag. And that gives you multiple lines of text. And if necessary, if there's more text or more lines than can be displayed, the browser should automatically produce a scrolling window for you. Okay. And then the rest of it, okay, submitting and resetting forms just very quickly. For submit, the type is submit. The value is what label appears. So presumably Expedia had the value equals search for its submit button. And that will submit your form to the browser. And the reset button, you can also have a type reset, that will reset your form to the default values. Okay? One word of parting on this. This annoys me to no end, so please, when you design your forms, don't make this mistake. Nothing seems to tick me off more than entering some information in the form, having the form tell me I didn't enter something properly, correcting it, going to submit it, and it's now blanked out 5 other parts of the form that I previously filled in. Okay? Whatever you do, try to save the information in the form, and if the user messes up, only have them fix that one part of the form and leave the information in the rest of the form. It will save a lot of teeth gnashing from your users. Okay, so don't reset the form to the default values just because the user input something erroneously. And that is my parting comment. So on Tuesday, we will see how we deal with this form data on the client side. Also, I'm sorry, on the server side. Read the other stuff. It's just interesting information that is not as important to us, but you still should know. It should be pretty quick to read it.